Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take the material you're interested in, explore it, and pull out the key insights for you. Basically a shortcut to getting informed.
That's the idea.
And today, we're tackling a pretty huge question. Why do some societies thrive while others, well, they just don't make it?
Yeah, it's fundamental, really.
Our mission for this deep dive is to explore exactly that, using the source you shared with us. Jared Diamond's Collapse: How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed.
It's a really sweeping book, looks at societies way back in history, but also brings it right up to modern times.
Okay.
Examines what led to success or, failure.
It makes you think about that poem, Shelley's Ozymandias.
Oh, yeah. The shattered statue in the desert.
Exactly. A powerful reminder that even, the biggest civilizations can just disappear.
And that's the core question Diamond's asking, isn't it? What causes that? Why do these seemingly permanent societies just vanish?
Right. And he starts off with this really striking contrast. He talks about Hull's Farm in Montana. It's a family dairy, doing pretty well.
In a growing area, yeah.
And then compares it to Gardar Farm in Norse Greenland. Once this major bishop's estate, now just ruins, abandoned for, over 500 years?
The whole society gone. It's almost impossible to really picture it, isn't it? A thriving community like Norse Greenland just fading away.
It's like, it feels unthinkable that somewhere like modern Montana could face that kind of fate.
But that's the puzzle, right? That's what we're trying to unpack for you today using Diamond's work.
So how does he approach this? It seems like a massively complex issue.
Well, he gives us a framework, which is really helpful. A 5-point framework, he calls it. Think of it like a checklist of factors to consider when looking at any society's health or its trajectory.
Okay, 5 factors. What are they?
So first, how humans impact their environment. Second, climate change, the natural shifts. Third, how a society gets along with its friendly neighbors, trade partners and allies.
Makes sense.
Fourth is the flip side, relations with hostile neighbors. And fifth, maybe the most critical one, is how the society actually responds to its problems. Environmental, social, whatever.
Okay, that sounds like a solid structure. Let's maybe dig into that framework, starting with a place you might not expect, Montana.
Yeah, modern Montana. He spends a good chunk of the book on it.
Which seems a bit surprising, maybe. I mean, it's part of the U.S., a wealthy country. Why Montana?
Well, Diamond argues it's actually a really insightful modern case study. Yes, it's part of a wealthy nation, but it's still facing some pretty significant environmental challenges and population pressures, too.
Okay.
And historically, its economy was built pretty heavily on just 3 things: mining, logging, and farming.
Right, the traditional industries.
Exactly. And all 3 have seen, major declines. And they've left their mark on the landscape, sometimes in damaging ways.
Okay, let's break those down. Mining, for example. Montana, especially around Butte, has that long copper mining history.
A very long history, but not always a clean one. Well, take the Anaconda Copper Mining Company. Even 100 years ago, the toxic effects were obvious. Ranchers were suing because their cows were dying from the smelter fumes and contaminated water.
Wow, a century ago.
Yeah. Now, Anaconda did eventually build settling ponds for the waste, but it just highlights this long-running conflict, right, between extracting resources for profit and the environmental damage it can cause.
And how does that play out today? Are things different now?
Things have changed. There are more regulations. Like, mining companies in the U.S. generally have to post bonds now. Money set aside to cover cleanup if they go bankrupt.
Ah, okay, so that protects the taxpayer.
Ideally. But Diamond points out that many older mines, and even some newer ones, were underbonded. The bond wasn't actually enough to cover the full cost of cleanup, meaning taxpayers could still end up footing the bill for cleaning up that toxic legacy, potentially for a very long time. So even with rules, there's this systemic challenge, balancing the economic gain now versus the environmental costs later.
Right, a difficult balance. Okay, what about the second one? Forestry. Those huge Montana forests must be valuable.
They are, but there are limitations. Montana's climate colder, drier, higher elevation. It means trees grow much slower than in, say, the southeastern U.S.
Ah, so it takes longer to regenerate after logging.
Much longer. He uses the example of Plum Creek, a big timber company. They own land all over, and they can get a much faster return on investment logging timber in Georgia or Alabama than in Montana. It's just basic economics for them.
I see. So the economics aren't as favorable.
Not as much. Plus, there's more public pressure now to preserve forests, and fighting fires in those remote, rugged areas is incredibly expensive.
And our understanding of fire has changed too, hasn't it?
Totally. The old policy was suppress all fires, but we now know that actually led to forests becoming overgrown, building up fuel.
Setting the stage for bigger, much worse fires later on.
Exactly. We've learned that natural lightning-caused fires actually play a role in keeping many of those forest ecosystems healthy. It's complex.
Okay, so mining and forestry face the challenges. What about the third leg? Agriculture, farming in Montana.
Also facing some serious issues. In the areas that rely just on rainfall, dryland farming, they have a big problem with something called saline seeps.
Saline seeps.
Yeah, it's basically salt accumulating in the topsoil. Makes it really hard for crops to grow. But even in areas with irrigation, there's salinization happening because the irrigation water itself carries dissolved salts that build up over time.
So salt is a problem either way.
Pretty much. And then there's this interesting cross-border issue he mentions. In neighboring Wyoming, they're extracting methane gas from coal beds.
Okay.
And that process involves pumping in water, which dissolves natural salts in the ground. That salty water then flows downstream into Montana's Powder River Basin, affecting water quality for farmers there.
Wow, so actions in one state directly impacting another.
Absolutely. And on top of all that, you've got invasive weeds. A huge problem. Diamond quotes estimates of over $100 million in economic damage each year just from weeds in Montana. Managing them is this constant, costly battle for farmers.
It sounds like a lot of interconnected environmental stresses, even in a place we think of as relatively pristine.
It really is. But Diamond doesn't just focus on the environment. He also highlights a really important social dimension to what's happening in Montana. It's this growing tension, especially in places like the Bitterroot Valley, between longtime residents, the old-timers, and newer arrivals, often wealthier people moving in from out of state.
The culture clash.
Exactly. You've got rising land prices, driven partly by demand for second homes or retirement properties. This makes it incredibly hard for local families, especially farming families, to afford to stay, or for young people to get started.
Yeah, I can see how that would cause friction.
He quotes the state senator, Rick Label, who says something like, "For a farmer, his land is his only pension fund." So when that land becomes worth way more for development than for growing crops or raising cattle, it forces really tough choices.
You lose the traditional way of life.
You can. And you get this clash of values, too. Newcomers might have different ideas about how land should be used, about wildlife, about development. Diamond includes perspectives from several Montanans, Chip Pigman, Tim Holes, John Cook, and they really voice these worries about growth, about losing the character of the place, the financial squeeze on traditional livelihoods.
So Montana serves as this contemporary window into how societies navigate these kinds of environmental and social pressures.
Precisely. A modern laboratory, in a way.
Right.
But then Diamond pivots, using this understanding to look back at past societies that didn't successfully navigate those pressures, societies that actually collapsed.
Let's talk about that term, collapse. What exactly does Diamond mean by it?
He's pretty specific. It's not just, a city getting conquered or a temporary dip in population. He defines collapse as a drastic decrease in human population size and a major simplification of political, economic, and social complexity.
Okay, across a considerable area and lasting for an extended time, so it's a major, enduring downturn.
Got it. And which societies fit that definition, according to him?
Well, he lists quite a few familiar names, the Anasazi and Cahokia here in North America, the classic Maya civilization in Central America,
Right.
the Moche and Tiwanaku in South America. Back in Europe, Mycenaean Greece, Minoan Crete, Great Zimbabwe in Africa, Angkor Wat and the Harappan civilization in Asia, and then the really isolated ones like Easter Island and the Norse in Greenland that we already mentioned.
That's quite a list. It really challenges that sometimes romantic idea we have about the past, doesn't it? Like people used to live in perfect balance with nature.
Oh, completely. Diamond strongly argues against that lost Eden idea. He says managing resources sustainably has always been hard for humans, pretty much ever since we developed sophisticated tools and hunting abilities.
Even way back. Yeah. He points to the evidence of megafauna extinctions. The giant sloths, mammoths, stuff like that often happened shortly after humans arrived on new continents or islands. It suggests we've always had the potential to overuse resources.
So the challenges aren't new.
The fundamental issues are timeless. Like, you arrive somewhere, the resources seem limitless at first. It's hard to see the depletion happening, especially if there are natural ups and downs. And getting everyone to agree on limits or conservation, that's always been tough. Collective action is hard.
So any society could potentially fall into that trap.
Any society. It's not about being primitive or modern. It's about how human groups interact with their environment, especially when faced with abundance or perceived abundance.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But if lots of societies face similar kinds of challenges, like deforestation or soil depletion, why did some end up collapsing while others found ways to, survive or even thrive?
Now that is the crucial question. And it brings us right back to the fifth factor in Diamond's framework.
The society's response to its problems.
Exactly, how they respond. Diamond really emphasizes this point. Societies react differently to similar environmental problems.
Can you give an example?
Deforestation is a great one he uses. It was a major factor in the collapse of Easter Island, Mangareva, and Norse Greenland. But other societies faced similar pressures and didn't collapse.
Like who?
Like people in the highlands of New Guinea who developed really sophisticated long-term forestry and soil management, or Japan during the Tokugawa era, or the island of Tikopia or Tonga. They all figured out ways to manage their forests sustainably.
So what makes the difference? Why do some respond effectively and others don't?
Well, Diamond argues it comes down to a society's political, economic, and social institutions, and also its cultural values, the deeply held beliefs about the world and their place in it. Those factors shape whether a society can recognize a problem and whether it chooses to do something about it.
Let's maybe explore one of those collapses in more detail then. Norse Greenland seems like a really compelling case.
It really is. Diamond paints this vivid picture. They arrive around 984 AD, led by Eric the Red. And initially, they do quite well.
Why was that? What advantages did they have?
A few things lined up for them. First, they found a landscape that hadn't really been impacted by European-style farming before virgin territory, in a sense, with decent grazing land, especially in the fjords.
Mm-hmm.
Second, the climate was actually milder back then, during what's called the medieval warm period. Sea routes to Iceland and Norway were relatively ice-free.
So good conditions and good connections.
Right. And third, there was strong demand back in Europe for luxuries from the Arctic, especially walrus ivory and hides. This trade gave the Greenland Norse something valuable to exchange for goods they couldn't produce themselves, like iron and grain.
So, a promising start, but obviously it didn't last. What started to go wrong?
Well, several interconnected problems started to bite. Deforestation was a huge one. Greenland never had extensive forests, mostly just birch and willow scrub in the sheltered fjords. The Norse cut that down pretty quickly for building material and, crucially, for fuel.
Fuel for heating and cooking.
Yes, and also for making charcoal, which they needed to smelt iron from local sources, like bog iron. But extracting bog iron itself required a lot of charcoal, so deforestation limited their ability to make their own iron tools and weapons.
So they became more dependent on imports from Europe.
Exactly. And the lack of timber for building meant they relied heavily on using turf, cutting blocks of sod to build their houses and barns.
And that caused other problems.
It did. Greenland's soils are thin, formed slowly in that cold climate. Cutting the turf damaged the vegetation cover, led to soil erosion, especially from the wind, and reduced the already limited pasture land for their animals. He mentions finds at archaeological sites like the farm beneath the sands, showing they were even scavenging timber from older, abandoned buildings towards the end.
Wow, desperate measures. It really highlights how dependent they were on that fragile landscape.
Incredibly dependent. And what's striking is their apparent inability, or maybe unwillingness, to adapt their lifestyle significantly, especially when you compare them to the other people living in Greenland at the time, the Inuit.
Ah, right. The Inuit were there too. How did they manage?
The Inuit, or Thule culture, as archaeologists call them, were masters of Arctic survival. They had technology. The Norse lacked kayaks and larger skin boats called umiaks for hunting seals, walrus, even whales at sea. They had toggle-headed harpoons, sophisticated fishing gear, warm, tailored skin clothing.
Skills perfectly suited to that environment.
Perfectly suited. They could exploit marine resources far more effectively than the Norse, who remained primarily focused on their European-style livestock, farming cattle, sheep, goats.
And the Norse just didn't learn from the Inuit, didn't adopt their techniques.
Largely, no. It's quite remarkable. They lived in the same environment for centuries, sometimes in nearby areas, but there's very little archaeological evidence of the Norse adopting Inuit technology or hunting strategies. Diamond mentions a story from the sagas about a Norseman named Einar Sokasson who tried using an Inuit kayak and, well, failed miserably.
So why not? Was it just pride or something else?
Diamond suggests it was deeply cultural, a powerful sense of ethnocentrism. The Norse saw themselves as farmers, as Christians, as Europeans. They viewed the Inuit, whom they called Skraelings, as pagan, inferior, maybe even non-human.
Wow.
This cultural barrier seems to have prevented them from learning valuable survival skills from the Inuit or even engaging in significant trade with them, despite the fact that both groups often faced starvation. They clung to their identity even when it was maladaptive.
That's a powerful and kind of tragic insight. Clinging to your identity even when it hurts your survival chances.
It really is. It shows how cultural values aren't always rational or beneficial in a purely practical sense.
And then, on top of the environmental damage and the cultural rigidity, the climate started to change, right?
Yes. The medieval warm period ended, and the climate shifted towards what we call the Little Ice Age. Temperatures dropped, winters got longer and harsher, and crucially, sea ice increased.
Making farming harder and travel more difficult.
Exactly. Shorter growing seasons made it tougher to grow enough hay to feed their livestock through the winter. And increased sea ice choked the sailing routes to Iceland and Norway, disrupting trade and contact with Europe.
So they were becoming more isolated.
More isolated and facing more pressure on their food sources. Archaeological evidence, like analyzing the bones found in their rubbish heaps, shows a clear shift in their diet over time.
Towards what?
Towards more marine food, especially seals. As raising livestock became harder, they relied more and more on hunting. Isotope analysis of Norse skeletons confirms this. The chemical signatures show an increasing proportion of seafood in the diet in the later centuries.
So they did adapt somewhat by hunting more seals.
They did, but perhaps not enough, or not effectively enough compared to the Inuit. And even their connection to the church in Europe might have inadvertently caused problems.
How so? The church.
Well, Greenland had its own bishopric, but the bishops and high-ranking clergy were Europeans. They maintained European tastes and priorities. Diamond suggests they might have preferred beef from their own dwindling herds over seal meat and directed community efforts towards things like the dangerous Norgseta hunt far to the north.
Why hunt way up there?
To get luxury goods like walrus ivory and polar bear skins, to trade for European goods the church wanted, like bronze bells or stained glass windows for the cathedral. Resources that arguably might have been better spent on more essential local needs.
So resources being directed away from immediate survival needs towards maintaining a European identity and status.
That seems to be part of the picture. So when you put it all together for Norse Greenland,
It's a complex mix.
it really is. You've got the environmental damage they cause themselves, deforestation, soil erosion, then climate change making things worse. You have increasingly hostile relations with their neighbors, the Inuit, there's evidence of conflict. You have the loss of support from their friendly neighbor, Norway, as contact dwindled. And finally, that critical failure to question their own core values and adapt their culture to the realities of Greenland. It's a classic case of multiple factors leading to collapse.
That's a sobering story. Okay, let's turn to another really iconic example of collapse Diamond discusses. Easter Island, Rapa Nui.
Easter Island. Famous for those incredible statues, the moai. But the story behind them is equally incredible and much darker.
Because it's another story of environmental destruction.
A really stark one. Diamond lays out the evidence very clearly. Pollen analysis from lake sediments and analysis of charcoal in the soil show that when Polynesian settlers first arrived, maybe around 900 AD, the island was covered in a lush subtropical forest, including giant palm trees.
Giant palm.
Yeah, related to the Chilean wine palm, possibly the largest palm trees in the world at the time. But by the time Europeans arrived in the 1700s, the island was almost completely treeless, just grassland.
They cut them all down.
It seems so. And this deforestation had, just like in Greenland, a cascade of negative effects. Massive soil erosion, which reduced agricultural yields, loss of timber for building houses, and, crucially, for building seaworthy canoes.
So it affected their fishing.
Hugely. And they also lost the wood needed for fuel. And, ironically, the very timber and rope needed to transport and erect those enormous statues they were carving. He also notes that the Polynesian rats that arrived with the settlers likely played a role too by eating the palm nuts and preventing the forest from regenerating.
It seems almost mad. Why invest so much effort in carving and moving hundreds of giant stone statues if your environment is crumbling around you?
That's the great puzzle of Easter Island. Diamond offers a few explanations for why the statue building became such an obsession.
Like what?
First, the island just happened to have excellent volcanic tuff at the Ranararaku quarry. Perfect material for carving large statues relatively easily.
Okay, good resources.
Second, Easter Island is incredibly isolated, very far from any other inhabited islands. This meant there were fewer outlets for competition between chiefs and clans compared to other Polynesian islands where warfare, trade, and alliance building with neighbors were more common. Statue raising became the primary way to display power and status.
So statue competition took the place of other rivalries.
Seems likely. Third, at least initially, the island might have been somewhat politically integrated, allowing all clans access to that central quarry. And finally, and this is key, the islanders developed intensive agriculture, possibly including stone-mulched gardens that produced enough surplus food, controlled by the elite, to support the specialized carvers and the large labor force needed to move the statues.
So they had the means, the motive, and the opportunity, at least for a while.
Exactly. But eventually the environmental destruction caught up with them.
How did the lack of trees really hit them?
The loss of large trees meant they could no longer build big, seaworthy canoes. This cut them off from deep-sea fishing things like porpoises and tuna, which archaeological evidence shows were once an important part of their diet. They were restricted to much smaller, less productive nearshore fishing and raising chickens.
A major loss of protein.
A huge loss. And this resource depletion seems to have triggered a complete societal breakdown.
How do we know?
The archaeological and oral tradition evidence points to a period of intense social and political upheaval. The power of the hereditary chiefs and priests, who had likely justified their rule by promising prosperity through the statues and rituals, seems to have collapsed.
Replaced by?
Replaced by a new class of military leaders, the Matatoa. Society descended into chronic warfare between clans. We find huge numbers of obsidian spear points called mataha from this later period. Oral traditions talk about cannibalism, people abandoned the coasts and moved inland, living in fortified settlements, or even hiding in caves for safety.
It sounds absolutely terrifying, a complete spiral downwards.
It really does, and it leads back to that haunting question Diamond poses. What did the Easter Islander who cut down the last palm tree say while he was doing it?
Yeah. How could they not see it coming?
It's deeply perplexing. Diamond suggests it wasn't one single decision, but likely a gradual process. Maybe driven by short-term thinking, competition between clans, if we don't cut this tree, they will, deeply ingrained religious or cultural beliefs tied to the statues.
A tragedy of the commons, maybe.
Perhaps partly. He delves into the psychology of denial and groupthink later in the book. He also notes that deforestation happened on other Polynesian islands too, but the rate varied depending on factors like rainfall, the impact of ash fallout, and how far the island was from sources of Asian dust that could replenish soil nutrients.
So Easter Island wasn't unique, just maybe an extreme case.
An extreme case, partly due to its isolation and maybe specific environmental vulnerabilities. He briefly compares it to the fates of Mangareva, Pitcairn, and Henderson Islands, a network where deforestation on Mangareva eventually led to the collapse and possible extinction or near extinction of the populations on the other islands that depended on it for trade. Some of those stories might involve, violence, cannibalism, maybe even mass suicide or starvation. Really grim possibilities.
Grim indeed. But it's important to remember not all societies went down this path. Diamond contrasts these failures with success stories, right?
Absolutely. And these offer really valuable lessons and maybe some hope. He highlights places like Tikopia, a tiny, very isolated Polynesian island.
What did they do differently?
Tikopia faced similar resource pressures, but developed what Diamond calls a bottom-up approach. Because the island was so small, everyone could see the impacts of environmental damage. They developed strong community control over resources, made collective decisions, like famously deciding to eliminate all their pigs because they were competing with humans for food, and understood that everyone's survival depended on sustainable practices.
So small scale and shared fate drove cooperation.
Exactly. And then you have a very different example, Tokugawa, Japan, from roughly 1603 to 1867.
A much larger, more complex society.
Right. Japan faced severe deforestation due to population growth and the building of huge castles and cities. But the ruling shogun and the regional lords realized this was threatening the country's stability. So they implemented a top-down solution.
How?
Through strict, centrally enforced forest management regulations. They controlled logging, invested in reforestation, developed silviculture. It took a long time, but they successfully reversed the deforestation trend and created sustainable forestry practices that persist today.
Two very different approaches, bottom up and top down. but both successful.
Yes. And he also mentions the sophisticated, long-term agroforestry systems developed over centuries by people in the New Guinea highlands as another example of success in a challenging environment.
So these past examples, both the collapses and the successes, they're not just ancient history. They have relevance today.
Immense relevance. Diamond argues that the same dynamics are playing out now, but on a global scale. And because our world is so interconnected through globalization, a collapse today wouldn't likely be isolated like Easter Island. It could be global.
That's a sobering thought. Does he look at modern examples of this interconnectedness and differing responses?
He does. The contrast between the Dominican Republic and Haiti is really powerful. They share the same island, Hispaniola, similar environments, similar histories of colonialism and dictatorship.
But vastly different outcomes today.
Vastly different. The Dominican Republic has maintained much more of its forest cover and has a significantly higher standard of living, generally speaking. Haiti has suffered from extreme deforestation, soil erosion, and crushing poverty.
Why the difference?
Diamond attributes a lot of it to differences in government policies and leadership, even under dictators. Trujillo, in the DR, for instance, despite being a brutal dictator, did implement some forest conservation measures, perhaps partly for his own benefit, controlling the watershed around his estates. Balaguer, who followed him, also pursued some environmental policies.
So leadership, even flawed leadership, made a difference.
It appears so. Haiti, unfortunately, had a history of leaders who perhaps prioritized short-term gain or personal enrichment over long-term environmental stewardship. And globalization plays a role, too. The environmental and economic problems in Haiti drive migration across the border into the DR, creating new social tensions there. It shows how problems in one place don't stay contained anymore.
And he also looks at some global giants like China and Australia.
Yes, two critical modern case studies. China, because of its sheer size, huge population, rapid economic growth, its environmental impact is enormous and global. Air pollution, water pollution, soil degradation, habitat loss, massive dam projects. The list is long.
A huge challenge.
A monumental challenge. But Diamond also acknowledges that the Chinese government is acutely aware of these problems and is investing heavily in environmental protection, reforestation, renewable energy. So it's this complex picture of massive problems, but also massive efforts to address them. The outcome is still uncertain, but maybe cautiously hopeful.
In Australia, what's the focus there?
Australia is interesting. He analyzes it through the lens of a society trying to impose European values and practices onto a continent with a very different, much older, more fragile environment. He talks about mining non-renewable resources, not just minerals, but also soil nutrients and water.
What kinds of problems?
Things like the naturally low nutrient levels in Australian soils, widespread salinity caused by land clearing and irrigation, severe water scarcity and overuse, especially in the Murray-Darling Basin, and the devastating impact of introduced species like rabbits and foxes.
Another case of clashing values and environmental reality.
Exactly. But again, it's not all negative. He also highlights positive developments like innovative land management on large pastoral stations, and private conservation initiatives like Kelparam Station, which focuses on ecological restoration.
So even when the problems are recognized, societies don't always act effectively. Diamond gets into why that happens, right?
Yes, this is a really crucial part of the analysis. He builds on the work of anthropologist Joseph Tainter, asking, why do complex societies often fail to take corrective action, even when the writing is on the wall?
What are some of the reasons?
Well, sometimes it's a genuine failure to anticipate a problem because it's outside their previous experience. Like the Norse Greenlanders couldn't foresee the European market for walrus ivory collapsing due to competition from Russian sources and changing tastes. Or the lowland Maya might not have understood how deforestation on hillsides would cause soil erosion that buried their fields downslope.
Okay, lack of experience.
But more often, he argues, the problem is perceived, but societies still fail to act, or act effectively. And this often comes down to clashes of interest. What he calls rational behavior from the perspective of individuals or small groups, even if it's disastrous for the society as a whole.
Can you give an example of that? What rational bad behavior?
Perverse subsidies are a classic example he uses. Governments might subsidize industries like fishing or logging or certain types of agriculture in ways that encourage overexploitation of the resource.
Why would they do that?
Because the industry benefiting from the subsidy is often well organized, politically connected, and lobbies hard for it. The costs, the environmental damage, the long-term economic harm are spread thinly across the entire population, who are less organized and might not even be aware of the subsidies' effects. So a small group profits rationally, while the majority pays the price unknowingly.
That sounds familiar.
It's a common pattern. Another factor is the difference between short-term and long-term stakes.
How does that work?
Think about tropical rainforest logging. If a foreign company gets a short-term lease, their rational incentive is to cut down as many valuable trees as quickly as possible before the lease runs out, with little regard for regeneration or long-term damage.
Because they won't be around to deal with the consequences.
Exactly. They're like what economists call roving bandits. Contrast that with someone who owns the forest land and plans to pass it down to their children, a stationary bandit, if you will. They have a much stronger incentive to manage it sustainably for long-term profit.
Makes sense. What about the role of the rich and powerful? The elites.
That's another critical factor. When elites can insulate themselves from the consequences of environmental damage or resource depletion. If the wealthy live in gated communities with imported food and clean water, they might not feel the effects of pollution or deforestation that impact the poor much more directly.
So they have less incentive to fix the problems.
Right. He contrasts this with societies where the elites share the same risks as everyone else. Like in the Netherlands, where much of the country is below sea level, the rich and poor alike depend on the dikes holding. Or in traditional New Guinea societies, where the big men lived in the same villages and ate the same food as everyone else, they couldn't escape the consequences of bad decisions.
Are there modern examples of this insulation?
He touches on it with resource extraction companies. Sometimes they can cause significant environmental damage and then avoid the cleanup costs. One way is through bankruptcy. He gives the example of the Pegasus Gold Company and the Zortman-Landusky gold mine in Montana. They used cyanide heap bleaching, caused massive water pollution, and then declared bankruptcy, leaving taxpayers potentially on the hook for billions in long-term cleanup costs.
So the company profits, the public pays for the mess.
That's the risk. He discusses the often, frankly, morally reprehensible behavior of some logging and mining companies, especially in developing countries with weaker regulations or corrupt governance. This rape-and-run model, as he calls it.
Is it just greed? Or is it more systemic?
He suggests it's a mix of economics, corporate culture, and sometimes the prevailing attitudes in society and government that allow it to happen. But he also notes that things can change. Public pressure, consumer awareness, and initiatives like the Forest Stewardship Council, FSC, which certifies sustainably harvested wood, can create incentives for companies to behave more responsibly. He even gives a nuanced example of Chevron in New Guinea, potentially adopting better practices partly due to economic incentives and public image concerns, while cautioning that this doesn't apply across the whole industry.
So bringing all these historical and modern examples together, what's Dima's assessment of where we stand today, globally?
Well, he concludes by laying out the major environmental problems facing the entire world. It's a pretty daunting list.
Let's hear it.
Okay, deep breath. He lists destruction of natural habitats, decline of wild food sources, especially fisheries, loss of biodiversity, degradation of soils, running out of fresh water in many regions, reaching the limits of sustainable energy use based on fossil fuels, buildup of toxic chemicals in the environment, changes to the atmosphere like ozone depletion and greenhouse gas buildup, the spread of invasive species, hitting the fundamental limits of photosynthetic capacity on Earth, and just the sheer cumulative impact of billions of humans.
Wow, that's a lot.
It is, and he stresses that these problems are all interconnected. They're not separate issues. And any one of them, he argues, could potentially limit our current lifestyles and population levels within the lifetimes of people alive today, maybe even within the next few decades.
That's a stark warning. But people often push back against these kinds of environmental concerns, right? Diamond addresses those objections.
He does. He tackles several common one-liner objections, as he calls them.
Like what?
Like the argument, environmental predictions have often been wrong in the past, so why worry?
Yeah, you hear that one.
His response is basically, that's like saying you shouldn't pay attention to a fire alarm because some past alarms turned out to be false. The potential cost of ignoring a real warning is just too high. Prudence dictates we should take warnings seriously, even if they aren't always perfectly accurate.
Okay, what's another objection?
Environmental concerns are a luxury only affordable by wealthy people in rich countries.
The idea that poor people only care about their next meal, not the environment.
Right. Diamond completely refutes this based on his own experiences working in places like New Guinea and Indonesia. He says people in the third world are often the most aware of environmental problems because they experience the consequences directly: soil erosion ruining their fields, deforestation drying up their streams, overfishing destroying their livelihoods.
Mm.
And, he notes, they often desperately want access to things like contraception to manage population growth, contrary to the stereotype.
Interesting. What else?
The classic technology will solve all our problems argument. Human ingenuity will save us.
The techno-optimist view.
Diamond acknowledges that technology and ingenuity are crucial, absolutely. But he argues they're not automatic solutions. We have to choose to develop and apply the right technologies. And crucially, we need to anticipate problems far enough in advance to have solutions ready. We can't just assume a magic fix will appear when we need it.
So ingenuity needs direction and foresight.
Precisely. Then there's the objection: the world is too big and nature too resilient for humans to really have a major impact globally.
Kind of an older view, maybe.
Yeah, and one that Diamond says is just demonstrably false now. We are changing the global climate, we are depleting fisheries across entire oceans, we have transformed the majority of the planet's usable land surface. Our impact is undeniably global now.
Okay. Any others?
One more he addresses is the idea that population growth is actually good because more people means more producers and consumers driving prosperity.
The more people, more wealth idea.
He counters this by pointing out that, empirically, the world's most populous countries are often disproportionately poor, while the wealthiest countries tend to have low or even negative population growth rates. There's no simple correlation suggesting that just having more bodies automatically leads to wealth. Often it leads to more pressure on limited resources.
So, having tackled those objections, what's the final takeaway message from this whole deep dive into collapse?
I think the core message is that the collapses of past societies aren't just historical curiosities. They offer incredibly relevant, urgent lessons for us today, understanding the interplay of environmental factors, climate change, neighborly relations, and especially a society's response to its challenges.
That fifth factor again.
That fifth factor, understanding that is absolutely vital if we want to navigate the very real, very complex global challenges we face now.
So it's about learning from the past to avoid repeating those failures.
Exactly. But it's not just a message of doom and gloom. He also highlights the factors that offer hope. Our capacity for long-term thinking, our ability to learn from mistakes, both our own and others, our potential for cooperation, technological innovation, and crucially, our willingness to reconsider deeply held values when they no longer serve us well. The success stories, like Tikopia and Tokugawa, Japan, show it is possible.
Requires conscious choices then.
Conscious choices, difficult choices sometimes, made for the common good and with the long term in mind.
Okay. Well, that gives us a lot to think about. And maybe on that note, here's a final thought for you, our listeners, to ponder. Reflecting on everything we've discussed from Diamond's work today, which of our current societal values or practices might bear a worrying resemblance to those that contributed to past collapses?
That's a good question to sit with.
And what steps might we consider taking as individuals, as communities, as a global society in light of these insights from the past? Something to mull over. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.